England, 1818. There are fates worse than death, and Miss Lydia Whitmore was about to discover that being sold like an animal was one of them. The rain had begun before dawn, a cold autumn drizzle that turned the streets of Mayfair into rivers of grey slush. Lydia stood at the drawing-room window of the Whitmore townhouse, her fingers pressed against the glass as though she might push through it and escape into the morning mist. Behind her, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the final hours of what remained of her life as she had known it. "You must understand my position, Miss Whitmore," came the smooth, cultured voice of Lord Geoffrey Carstairs. He sat in her father's chair, a liberty that made Lydia's jaw tighten. His legs crossed with the ease of a man who owned everything in the room, including her. "Your brother's debts are considerable. £15,000 is not a sum one simply forgives." Lydia turned from the window, her brown eyes meeting his without flinching. At 26, she had learned to wear composure as other women wore jewels, a necessary adornment that concealed the desperation beneath. Her chestnut hair, touched with copper where the lamplight caught it, was arranged in a simple knot at the base of her neck. She wore a morning dress of pale grey muslin, modest and worn at the cuffs, the last respectable gown that had not been sold to pay Thomas's mounting debts. "My brother was foolish," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But he is young. Surely there must be some other arrangement." Carstairs smiled, and Lydia felt her stomach turn. He was a handsome man, she supposed, in the way that a perfectly crafted mask might be handsome. His features were refined, his clothing impeccable, but there was something in his pale eyes that reminded her of winter ice, beautiful and deadly. "Oh, but there is an arrangement, my dear." He withdrew a folded document from his coat, the paper crackling as he opened it. "Your brother signed this contract 3 months ago. In it, he offers you as, shall we say, collateral for his debts. Should he fail to repay the sum within the agreed time, you become my property through marriage." A most creative solution, I thought, when he proposed it. The room tilted. Lydia gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "That is illegal." "Quite," Carstairs agreed pleasantly. "However, the contract has been registered with a certain registry office in Cheapside. The clerk there is remarkably accommodating to gentlemen of means. While the document would not survive scrutiny in a court of law, the scandal of its existence would destroy what little remains of your family's reputation. Your brother would face debtor's prison at best, criminal charges at worst, and you, my dear, would be ruined." "Where is Thomas?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. Her brother had not been home in 3 days. "Indisposed," Carstairs said, "hiding, perhaps, from the consequences of his actions. A habit of his, I understand." Lydia closed her eyes briefly. Thomas, her younger brother by 3 years, had been their father's golden child, the heir who would restore the Whitmore name to glory. Instead, he had squandered their modest inheritance at gaming tables and in the company of men who preyed on foolish young aristocrats with more title than sense. When their father, Viscount Whitmore, had died 2 years past, he left behind little more than the townhouse and a handful of investments that barely covered their living expenses. "You have 48 hours, Miss Whitmore," Carstairs continued, rising from the chair. "Bring me £15,000 and I shall return this contract and forget your brother's name. Fail to do so, and I shall call upon you with a special license and my family's clergyman. Either way, the debt will be satisfied." After he departed, the sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. Lydia sank into a chair, her hands shaking so violently that she had to clasp them together in her lap. "Miss!" The voice of Mrs. Dawson, their housekeeper, came from the doorway. The elderly woman's face was drawn with worry. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is it true, then? About Master Thomas?" "Yes," Lydia whispered. "He has sold me to pay his debts." Mrs. Dawson's hand flew to her mouth. "Dear Lord in heaven, what will you do?" Lydia stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that refused to stop trembling. "I will sell everything we have left, Mother's jewels, the silver, whatever might bring coin. You must send word to Lady Margaret in Bath. Tell her I need her help." But even as she spoke, Lydia knew the truth. Her mother's jewels, already diminished by previous sales to cover Thomas's gambling debts, might bring £3,000 at best. The silver and what few valuables remained would add little more. Lady Margaret Ashworth, her father's widowed sister, lived on a modest widow's portion in Bath. She had neither the means nor the connections to raise such a sum. The next 2 days passed in a desperate blur. Lydia visited every jeweller and pawnbroker in London who would receive her, each transaction stripping away another piece of her mother's memory. The pearl necklace that had been worn at her parents' wedding, the sapphire brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, the gold locket containing miniature portraits of her parents as young lovers. By the evening of the second day, she had raised £3,200. It was barely a fifth of what she needed. She sat alone in the drawing room as darkness fell, the money counted and recounted on the table before her, as though staring at it might somehow make it multiply. The fire had burned low in the grate, and she had not bothered to ring for more coal. What did it matter? In the morning, Carstairs would return, and her life as she knew it would end. The clock struck midnight when Mrs. Dawson appeared at the door, her face pale. "Miss, there is a visitor. A gentleman. He says it is urgent." At this hour? Lydia rose, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Who is it?" "He wouldn't give his name, miss, but he arrived in a very fine carriage. He says he has information regarding Lord Carstairs and your brother's debts." Hope, fragile and terrifying, flickered in Lydia's chest. "Show him in." The man who entered was not what she expected. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in evening clothes of impeccable quality but severe cut, all black and white without ornamentation. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, his eyes a startling blue that seemed to see straight through her worn gown and desperate circumstances to the fear beneath. He was perhaps 34, with a face that might have been handsome were it not so cold, so carefully devoid of expression. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I apologize for the late hour. My name is Adrian Valancourt, Duke of Northmere. I believe we have a matter of mutual interest to discuss." Lydia's breath caught. The Duke of Northmere was known throughout London, though more by reputation than by appearance. They called him the Duke of Ice, a man who had amassed a fortune through shrewd investments in naval shipping, while maintaining a distance from society that bordered on reclusiveness. He attended Parliament when duty demanded, but was never seen at balls or social gatherings. Rumour held that he had once been engaged, but the lady had died before the wedding, and he had never recovered. "Your Grace." Lydia managed a curtsy despite her shock. "I confess I do not understand. How do you know of my circumstances?" "Information is valuable, Miss Whitmore, and I make it my business to be well informed." He glanced at the money on the table, then back to her face. "I know that Lord Carstairs holds a fraudulent contract against you, registered through illegal means. I know that your brother has disappeared rather than face the consequences of his foolishness. And I know that you have approximately—" He paused, his gaze flickering to the counted coins and notes. "10 hours before Carstairs returns to claim you." "Then you know I am lost," Lydia said quietly. "Unless you have come to offer me £15,000 out of charity, which I cannot imagine." Something that might have been amusement touched his eyes. "Not charity, Miss Whitmore, a proposition. But first tell me, do you know who I am beyond my title?" "You are the Duke of Northmere. They say you were a friend to the Prince Regent before your retirement from society. They say your fortune rivals that of any man in England. And do you know why I have sought you out specifically, rather than simply paying Carstairs his blood money and forgetting your family's troubles?" Lydia shook her head, exhaustion and confusion making her bold. "I cannot fathom why a duke would concern himself with the troubles of a viscount's penniless daughter." "Your father once saved my father's life," Adrian said simply. "They were boys together, swimming in the lake at your father's estate in Hampshire. My father, the 4th Duke of Northmere, would have drowned had your father not pulled him from the water. It was a debt my father never forgot, though they lost touch in later years. When I heard the name Whitmore connected to Carstairs' schemes, I made inquiries." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since this nightmare began. My father never spoke of it. He would not have. He was, by all accounts, a man of honour. Adrian moved to the fireplace, stirring the dying coals with the poker. I propose to pay Carstairs £20,000 for the contract. The additional £5,000 will serve to humiliate him publicly, demonstrating that his schemes are worth less than the price I set. The contract will be transferred to my name. Horror and hope warred in Lydia's chest. You would own me? For 21 days, Adrian continued, his voice matter-of-fact. The Cheapside ledgers accept petitions only after 3 full weeks of posted notice, he said. It is a petty clerk's rule that has survived 3 magistrates, but it shields the annulment from procedural challenge. That is the legal minimum required to petition for the annulment of a fraudulent registry. At the end of that time, I will burn the contract in the proper registry office, witnessed by a magistrate. You will be free. Why 21 days? Lydia asked, her mind racing. Why not pay Carstairs and simply destroy the contract immediately? Because... Adrian turned to face her, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. I require something from you in return. For those 21 days, you will pose as my betrothed. The morning following Adrian Valancourt's midnight proposition, Lydia woke to find her world transformed in ways both terrifying and strangely liberating. She had accepted his offer, for what choice remained? By dawn, Mr. Edmund Price, the Duke's solicitor, had arrived at the Whitmore townhouse with documents to sign and instructions so precise that Lydia suspected they had been prepared days in advance. His Grace thinks of everything, Price said, as he arranged papers on the drawing-room table. He was a man of perhaps 40, with shrewd eyes behind spectacles, and the efficient manner of one accustomed to managing delicate affairs. The transaction with Lord Carstairs will occur at White's this afternoon. His Grace wishes you to remain here until the matter is concluded. And then? Lydia asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Then, Miss Whitmore, you will remove to the Duke's residence in Grosvenor Square. Separate quarters have been prepared in the West Wing. Your belongings should be packed by this evening. The reality of it struck her then. Within hours, she would leave the only home she had known, would enter the household of a man she had met but once, bound to him by a fraudulent contract that made her, however temporarily, his property in all but name. When Price departed, Lydia stood at the window, watching the street below. Carriages rolled past. Ladies in fine dresses strolled with their maids. And somewhere in this vast city, Thomas hid from the consequences of his actions, while she paid the price of his folly. Miss! Mrs. Dawson appeared at her elbow. Word has come from Bath. Lady Margaret is travelling to London immediately. She should arrive within 3 days. 3 days. By then, the charade would be well underway. That afternoon, in the exclusive confines of White's Gentlemen's Club, Adrian Valancourt made good on his promise. Lord Carstairs arrived at the appointed hour, his expression smug with anticipated victory. He found instead the Duke of Northmere waiting in a private room, Mr. Price at his side, and 3 witnesses whose names carried weight in London's highest circles. Carstairs, Adrian said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to command. I believe you hold a certain contract regarding Miss Lydia Whitmore. Carstairs' smile faltered. Your Grace, I was not expecting. That is, this is a private matter between myself and the Whitmore family. Was, Adrian corrected. Past tense. Mr. Price? The solicitor produced a leather portfolio. I have here a bank draft for £20,000, payable to Lord Geoffrey Carstairs upon surrender of all documents, contracts, and registry records pertaining to debts owed by Thomas Whitmore, Esquire, and any agreements involving his sister, Miss Lydia Whitmore. The colour drained from Carstairs' face. 20,000, but the debt is only 15. The additional 5,000, Adrian said softly, is to compensate you for the inconvenience of having your schemes exposed. You see, I have already made certain inquiries regarding the registry office in Cheapside. The clerk there proved remarkably forthcoming once he understood that obstruction would result in criminal prosecution. The contract you hold is illegal, registered through fraud, and worth precisely nothing in any legitimate court. Carstairs' hands clenched into fists. Then why pay me at all? Because, Adrian rose, his height and bearing making the other man step back involuntarily. I wish there to be no ambiguity. Mr. Price will witness your signature on documents transferring all claim on the Whitmore debts to me. The witnesses here present will attest that you accepted payment in full and acknowledge the settlement. Should you ever speak of this matter again, should you ever approach Miss Whitmore or her brother, I will ensure that every detail of your fraudulent schemes becomes public knowledge. Do I make myself clear? The transaction took less than an hour. Carstairs signed the papers with shaking hands, accepted the bank draft, and departed white a humiliated man. The whispers began before he reached the door. £20,000, Lord Pemberton murmured to his companion. For a viscount's penniless daughter. What can Northmere be thinking? Perhaps, replied the Earl of Ashworth, he is thinking of something other than money. By evening, the news had spread through Mayfair. The reclusive Duke of Northmere, who had avoided society for 8 years, had publicly paid an extraordinary sum to acquire the debts of the Whitmore family. Speculation ran rampant. Some said it was charity, born of friendship between their fathers. Others whispered of darker motivations. But when the Duke's carriage arrived at the Whitmore townhouse at precisely 6 o'clock, and Miss Lydia Whitmore emerged in a travelling cloak, her few belongings loaded behind, the truth became apparent. The Duke of Northmere was courting the impoverished Miss Whitmore. Lydia's first impression of the Duke's residence was one of overwhelming grandeur. The house in Grosvenor Square was 3 times the size of the Whitmore townhouse, its facade imposing in the fading light. Servants lined the entrance hall, their livery impeccable, their faces carefully neutral as they assessed their master's unexpected guest. Miss Whitmore, Adrian said formally as he handed her down from the carriage, may I present Mrs. Clara Hensworth, my housekeeper. She will show you to your quarters and attend to your needs. Mrs. Hensworth was a woman of perhaps 50, with iron grey hair and a bearing that suggested she had managed grander households than this. She curtsied respectfully. Welcome, miss, if you will follow me. The west wing was indeed separate, reached by a private staircase. The rooms prepared for Lydia were beautiful, decorated in soft blues and creams, with a sitting room, bedchamber, and dressing room that together exceeded the size of the entire upper floor of her former home. A fire burned in the grate, and fresh flowers adorned the mantelpiece. His Grace wishes you to rest this evening, Mrs. Hensworth said. A tray will be sent up for your dinner. Tomorrow morning, he requests your presence in the breakfast room at 9 o'clock. There are matters to discuss regarding your arrangement. After the housekeeper departed, Lydia sank onto a chair, suddenly exhausted. The events of the past days crashed over her. The discovery of Thomas's betrayal, the desperate scramble for funds, Carstairs' threats, and now this strange salvation that felt more like a gilded cage. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A maid entered, young and nervous. Begging your pardon, miss, but His Grace asked me to deliver this. She held out a sealed letter. Lydia broke the seal with trembling fingers. The handwriting was bold and precise. Miss Whitmore, you will have questions about our arrangement. Tomorrow I will explain what I require of you during these 21 days. For tonight, know only this. You are safe here. No one will harm you or make demands upon you. You have my word as a gentleman and the memory of my father's debt to yours. Sleep well. Northmere. Despite everything, Lydia felt tears threaten. When had anyone last offered her safety without condition? When had anyone protected her rather than used her? The next morning, Lydia descended to the breakfast room at precisely 9 o'clock. She had dressed carefully in one of her better morning gowns, pale yellow muslin that had seen better days, but remained respectable. Adrian was already seated, reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee at his elbow. Good morning, he said, rising as she entered. Please sit. Help yourself to whatever you wish. The sideboard held more food than Lydia had seen in months. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread, butter, jam, fruit. She took small portions, conscious of his gaze upon her, though he had returned ostensibly to his newspaper. We must establish the terms of our arrangement, Adrian said after she had settled. For the next 21 days, You will appear as my betrothed. We will attend 3 social events together, no more. You will handle my social correspondence, declining invitations I do not wish to accept, accepting those I must. Beyond these duties, your time is your own. And what? Lydia asked carefully. Do I tell people about how we met? About why you suddenly decided to court me? The truth, Adrian replied. Or enough of it. Your father and mine were friends. I heard of your family's difficulties and intervened. We renewed our acquaintance, discovered mutual affection, and decided to marry. Mutual affection, Lydia repeated, the words foreign on her tongue. It will satisfy society's curiosity without giving them fodder for scandal. He set down his newspaper. The alternative is to admit that your brother sold you to pay his gambling debts, which would destroy what remains of your reputation. Lydia flinched. You need not be quite so blunt. Forgiveness, Adrian said, though his tone did not soften. But I find that honesty, however painful, prevents misunderstandings. You should know that I will not require anything beyond what I have stated. Your quarters are private. Your person is inviolate. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. And at the end of 21 days? The contract will be destroyed. I will announce that we have mutually agreed to end our betrothal. You will receive a settlement of £5,000, sufficient to establish yourself independently, or return to your family's estate in Hampshire if you prefer. I will ensure your brother receives employment far from London, supervised work that will keep him from gaming tables. It was more than generous. It was salvation. Yet something in Adrian's voice, a careful emptiness, made Lydia wonder what had driven him to such an elaborate rescue of a stranger. Mrs. Hensworth mentioned, Lydia ventured, that you lost someone. 8 years ago. Adrian's expression shuttered completely. That is not relevant to our arrangement. Forgive me. I only meant I understand what it is to lose someone you love. My mother died when I was 18. My father 2 years past. Sometimes I think the grief never truly leaves. It simply becomes something we carry. For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. Her name was Caroline. Lady Caroline Devereux. We were to be married, but she fell ill 3 days before the wedding. The fever took her in less than a week. I am sorry, Lydia said, and meant it. It was a long time ago. He rose abruptly. I have business to attend. The first event we must attend is tomorrow evening, a dinner at Lord Pemberton's. Mrs. Hensworth will ensure you have an appropriate gown. He left before she could respond, his footsteps echoing in the hall. Lydia sat alone in the breakfast room, studying the half-eaten food on her plate and wondering what manner of man she had bound herself to, even temporarily. That afternoon, a letter arrived that changed everything. The letter that arrived from Thomas bore the seal of a boarding house in Cheapside, the wax cracked and smudged as though it had passed through many hands. Mrs. Hensworth brought it to Lydia's sitting room on a silver tray, her expression neutral, but her eyes sympathetic. It came by messenger, miss. The boy said he was paid to deliver it here specifically. Lydia waited until she was alone before breaking the seal. The handwriting was Thomas's, recognizable despite its unsteady quality, as though written by a hand that trembled. Lydia, forgive me. I know those words are worthless after what I have done, but I write them anyway, because I have nothing else left. I am in hiding, too ashamed to show my face. Carstairs came to me 3 months ago with a proposition. He said if I signed the contract, he would extend my debts another year, give me time to recover my losses. I thought I could win it back, Lydia. I thought one good hand would change everything. Instead, I lost more, and when I could not pay, he told me what I had truly signed. By then it was too late. I heard what the Duke did. £20,000. I do not deserve his mercy or yours. I will understand if you never wish to see me again. Your brother, Thomas. Lydia read the letter 3 times, fury and grief warring in her chest. She wanted to crumple the paper, throw it in the fire, pretend it had never arrived. But the words remained, a confession that changed nothing and everything. When Adrian returned that evening, she was waiting in the library, the letter clutched in her hand. Thomas has written, she said without preamble. He is in Cheapside, hiding in some boarding house. Adrian set down his gloves and hat. I know. I have had men watching him since the day after I paid Carstairs. He has not left the establishment except to purchase food, and he has not approached any gaming houses. Lydia stared at him. You have been watching my brother. I told you, Miss Whitmore, I make it my business to be well informed. Your brother's continued sobriety, or lack thereof, affects the success of our arrangement. If he falls back into gambling and creates new scandals, it reflects poorly on both of us. I should like to see him, Lydia said quietly. I know you said he should remain away from London, but he is my brother. I need to know he is well. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Tomorrow, he decided, I will take you to him. But there are conditions. We will bring him to my property in Bloomsbury, a house I maintain for visiting business associates. He will stay there, supervised, and I will arrange employment for him at the shipyard near the docks. If he proves himself capable of sobriety and honest work, we will discuss his future. You would do that? Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. After everything he has done? I do it for you, Adrian replied simply. And for the memory of my father's debt to yours. A debt between families extends to all members of that family, even foolish younger sons who gamble away their inheritance. The next morning dawned cold and bright, frost glittering on the windows of Adrian's carriage as they made their way through London's crowded streets toward Cheapside. Lydia sat across from Adrian, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to prepare herself for the confrontation ahead. The boarding house was shabby but respectable, the kind of place where gentlemen down on their luck took rooms when they could no longer afford better. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman with suspicious creases around her mouth, admitted them only after Adrian pressed a coin into her palm. Third floor, last door on the right. The young gentleman has been very quiet. Pays his rent on time. Causes no trouble. They found Thomas sitting at a small desk by the window, staring out at the street below. He turned when they entered, his face gaunt with sleeplessness and shame. At 23 he looked older. The boyish charm that had once made him their father's favourite worn away by guilt and fear. Lydia. He stood, his voice breaking. I did not expect, that is, I hoped you would come. But I did not think you would want to see me after you sold me to pay your debts. Lydia's voice was steady, though tears threatened. After you hid rather than face what you had done. Thomas flinched, as though struck. I have no defence. What I did was unforgivable. Yes, Lydia agreed. It was. Adrian, who had remained by the door, spoke then. Mr. Whitmore, I am Adrian Valancourt, Duke of Northmere. I have purchased your debts from Lord Carstairs and secured your sister's safety. Now we must discuss your future. Thomas turned to him, his expression wary. My future? I am offering you employment, Adrian said. Honest work at a shipyard I own near the docks. The hours are long, the labour difficult, and the pay modest. You will live in a house I maintain in Bloomsbury, under supervision. If you remain sober and prove yourself capable, there may be opportunities for advancement. If you fail, you will find yourself without employment or shelter. Why would you do this? Thomas asked, bewilderment and suspicion mixing in his voice. What do you gain from helping me? Your sister gains peace of mind, Adrian replied. That is sufficient. The simple answer seemed to undo Thomas completely. He sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. I do not deserve this. I do not deserve her forgiveness or your charity. No, Lydia said, stepping forward. You do not. But I am giving it anyway, because you are my brother, and because our parents would have wanted me to help you if I could. But Thomas, this is your final chance. If you squander it, if you return to gambling, or bring scandal upon yourself, I will not intervene again. Thomas looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. I swear to you, Lydia, I swear on our parents' graves, I will make this right. An hour later, they departed Cheapside with Thomas following in a second carriage to the house in Bloomsbury. Adrian had summoned his estate manager, a stern-faced man named Mr. Crawford, who would oversee Thomas's employment and ensure he remained away from gaming establishments. As their carriage rolled back toward Grosvenor Square, Lydia found herself studying Adrian's profile. He sat with perfect posture, gazing out the window, his expression as unreadable as ever. You show him more kindness than he deserves, she said finally. Perhaps, Adrian replied. But kindness, Miss Whitmore, is not always about what someone deserves. Sometimes it is about what they need to become better than they were. Is that what happened to you? The question escaped before Lydia could stop it. After Caroline died, did someone show you kindness? His jaw tightened. No. I retreated from the world and let grief turn me into something cold and distant. It is not a path I would recommend. Before Lydia could respond, the carriage jerked to a sudden halt. Adrian leaned forward, his expression alert. What is it? The driver's voice came from above. Apologies, Your Grace, but there is a commotion ahead. A crowd has gathered. Adrian opened the carriage door and stepped out, Lydia following despite his gesture for her to remain. They found themselves at the edge of a crowd surrounding a street vendor whose cart had overturned, spilling vegetables and bread into the mud. A small boy, no more than 7 years old, knelt among the wreckage, crying. Please, sir, the boy begged a well-dressed gentleman who stood nearby. It was an accident. I did not mean to bump your horse. Please, do not have me arrested. The gentleman sneered. Filthy urchin. You have ruined my boots and cost this vendor his livelihood. You should be taken to the magistrate. Adrian moved through the crowd with quiet authority, his presence parting the gathered spectators. What is the cost of the damages? The vendor, a haggard woman with work-worn hands, looked up at him. £3, Your Grace, maybe 4, with the cartwheel broken. Adrian withdrew a leather purse and counted out £5. For the damages and your trouble, the boy meant no harm. The well-dressed gentleman sputtered. See here, Northmere, you cannot simply... Can I not? Adrian's voice was soft, but carried a weight that made the other man step back. The matter is settled. I suggest you continue about your business. The gentleman departed, muttering about presumptuous dukes. The vendor curtsied deeply, clutching the money. The small boy, still crying, looked up at Adrian with eyes full of wonder and terror. Lydia, watching from the edge of the crowd, saw Adrian crouch down to the boy's level, his voice gentling in a way she had not heard before. What is your name? J. James, sir. Your Grace. James, you must be more careful around horses. They frighten easily. Do you understand? The boy nodded vigorously. Yes, Your Grace. Thank you, Your Grace. As they returned to the carriage, Lydia found her perception of Adrian shifting. This was not the cold, distant duke who sat across from her at breakfast. This was a man who noticed the struggles of street vendors and spoke gently to frightened children. That was kind of you, she said once they were moving again. It was practical, Adrian replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. Public disturbances delay travel. It was kind, Lydia insisted. And you know it was. He turned to look at her then, really look at her. And for a moment, the careful mask slipped. What she saw beneath was not the ice everyone spoke of, but rather loneliness, profound and aching, the kind that came from years of isolation. Perhaps, he said finally. I'm trying to remember what kindness feels like. That evening, the first of their 3 required social appearances, approached like an impending storm. Lydia dressed in the gown Mrs. Hensworth had procured for her, a creation of deep blue silk that must have cost more than she had spent on clothing in the past year. When she descended to the entrance hall, she found Adrian waiting, resplendent in evening dress that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders. You look well, he said, and something in his tone made her cheeks warm. As do you, she replied. The dinner at Lord Pemberton's was everything Lydia had dreaded, and more. The moment they entered the drawing room, conversation ceased. Every eye turned toward them, assessing, judging, hungry for gossip. Lady Pemberton, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and sharper wit, approached with predatory grace. Your Grace, how delightful to see you in society again. And this must be Miss Whitmore. How extraordinary that you should form an attachment so quickly. Not so extraordinary, Adrian replied smoothly. When one recognizes quality, one acts decisively. Throughout dinner, Lydia endured whispered speculation and barely concealed disdain from the other guests. She was seated between a pompous baron who ignored her entirely and a young lord who asked pointed questions about her family's finances. It was Adrian who rescued her, his voice cutting across the table with calm precision. Lord Winters, I believe Miss Whitmore was discussing the new lending library in Mayfair before you interrupted with your interrogation. Perhaps you might allow her to finish. Lord Winters flushed and fell silent. Lydia, meeting Adrian's gaze across the table, saw something there that made her breath catch, genuine interest, as though her thoughts about lending libraries actually mattered to him. When the evening finally ended and they returned to the carriage, Lydia felt exhausted but oddly triumphant. Thank you, she said, for defending me. They were rude, Adrian replied. I will not tolerate rudeness toward my betrothed, however temporary our arrangement. Lydia studied his profile in the dim light of passing street lamps. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Ice, she said honestly. They call you the Duke of Ice, but tonight I saw something different, something warmer. Adrian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Perhaps, Miss Whitmore, you are beginning to thaw me. The days following Lord Pemberton's dinner party passed with surprising ease. Lydia found herself falling into a comfortable rhythm within the Duke's household. Her mornings spent managing correspondence as Adrian had requested, her afternoons her own. Thomas sent word from Bloomsbury that he had begun work at the shipyard. His letters brief but earnest, describing the physical demands of unloading timber and the simple satisfaction of honest labour. It was the fourth day after the dinner when Lady Margaret arrived from Bath, sweeping into the house in Grosvenor Square with all the force of a summer storm. Lydia was in the library when Mrs. Hensworth announced her aunt, and she barely had time to stand before Margaret enveloped her in a fierce embrace. My dear girl, Margaret said, pulling back to study Lydia's face with sharp eyes. At 53, Lady Margaret Ashworth retained the bearing of a woman who had once been considered a beauty, her silver-streaked hair arranged fashionably, her travelling dress of deep burgundy, both elegant and practical. When I received Mrs. Dawson's letter, I came as quickly as I could. Now tell me everything, and do not spare the details. They sat by the fire while Lydia recounted the full story, from Thomas's betrayal to Carstairs' threats to Adrian's unexpected intervention. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. That foolish boy, she said finally, referring to Thomas. Your father would be heartbroken to see what his son has become. And this Duke, this arrangement you have entered into, what manner of man is he? I do not entirely know, Lydia admitted. He is reserved, formal. But there are moments when I glimpse something different beneath the surface. He has been generous with Thomas, offering him employment and a chance to redeem himself. And with me, he has been nothing but honourable. Honourable, Margaret repeated, her tone sceptical. Lydia, you are living in his house, posing as his betrothed. What happens at the end of these 21 days? Society will assume the worst if the engagement is broken. He has promised me a settlement, Lydia said. £5,000. Enough to establish myself independently or return to Hampshire. Margaret rose, pacing before the fireplace. Money is not everything, my dear. Your reputation, once tarnished, cannot be bought back. Before Lydia could respond, Adrian's voice came from the doorway. Lady Margaret, I presume. He entered, bowing respectfully. I am Adrian Valancourt. I apologise for not being present to greet you upon your arrival. I was attending to business. Margaret assessed him with the frankness of a woman who had seen too much of the world to be impressed by titles alone. Your Grace, my niece has explained your arrangement. I find it both generous and troubling in equal measure. Your concern is natural, Adrian replied. Perhaps we might speak privately. I would welcome the opportunity to address your questions directly. Margaret glanced at Lydia, who nodded. Very well, Your Grace. I should like to understand your intentions toward my niece. They withdrew to Adrian's study, leaving Lydia alone in the library. She tried to read, but found herself staring at the same page for half an hour, wondering what her aunt and the Duke were discussing. When they finally emerged, Margaret's expression had softened considerably. Well, she said to Lydia, It seems the Duke is precisely as you described. Honourable, if unconventional. I shall stay at the Clarendon Hotel for the duration of your arrangement. The Clarendon, being the most central and most gossiped about address in Mayfair, was where half of London arranged to be seen. That way, I am nearby should you need me, but I do not compromise the propriety of the situation further. After Margaret departed, Lydia found Adrian still in his study, staring at papers on his desk without seeming to see them. "What did you tell her?" she asked from the doorway. "The truth," he replied. "That I owe your family a debt I can never fully repay. That I intend to see you established safely and independently at the end of our arrangement. And that," he hesitated, "I find your presence in this house less burdensome than I anticipated." "Less burdensome," Lydia repeated with the ghost of a smile. "What fulsome praise, Your Grace." He looked up then, and she saw something unexpected in his blue eyes. Warmth, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "Forgive me. I am not accomplished at expressing, that is. What I mean to say is that you have made these past days more pleasant than I expected." Before Lydia could respond, Mr. Price arrived with news that required Adrian's immediate attention. She returned to the library, her heart beating strangely fast, wondering at the shift she felt occurring between them, subtle but undeniable. The second required social event arrived 4 days later, a ball at the Ashworth estate in Mayfair. The Earl and Countess were distant cousins of Lady Margaret, and the invitation had arrived with a pointed note suggesting that the Duke's sudden betrothal had created much speculation that only his presence could address. Lydia dressed with care in a gown of deep emerald silk that Mrs. Hensworth had commissioned from the finest modiste in Bond Street. When she descended the stairs, she found Adrian waiting in the entrance hall, and the expression on his face when he saw her made her breath catch. "You are beautiful," he said simply, as though the words had escaped without permission. "Thank you," Lydia managed, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You look very well yourself." The ballroom was crowded with London's elite, and their entrance caused the same shocked silence as at Lord Pemberton's dinner. But this time, Lydia held her head high, her hand resting lightly on Adrian's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. The evening passed in a blur of introductions and barely civil inquiries. Lady Ashworth, a woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, proved to be an ally, steering Lydia away from the more venomous gossips and introducing her to ladies who had known her mother in their youth. It was during the supper dance that everything changed. Adrian had led Lydia onto the floor for a waltz, his hand at her waist, sending warmth through the silk of her gown. They moved together with surprising harmony, as though they had danced together many times before. "You are doing well," Adrian said quietly. "They expected you to cower, but you meet them with dignity." "I learned from watching you," Lydia replied. "You face society's judgment with such calm indifference." "It is not indifference," he admitted. "It is armour. After Caroline died, I could not bear the pity in their eyes, the whispers about the Duke who had lost his love. So I built walls between myself and the world." "And now?" Lydia asked, daring to meet his gaze. "Now," he said softly, "I find those walls beginning to crumble." The music swelled around them, and Lydia felt the world narrowing to just the two of them, his blue eyes intense on hers, his hand warm through her glove. When the dance ended, he escorted her from the floor, but his hand lingered at her elbow longer than propriety demanded. They returned to Grosvenor Square near midnight, the carriage ride passing in comfortable silence. At the door to her chambers, Adrian paused. "Miss Whitmore, Lydia," he corrected himself. "I wonder if I might ask something of you." "Of course. Would you join me in the music room? There is something I should like to show you." Curious, Lydia followed him down the corridor to a room she had not yet entered. It was smaller than the other reception rooms, dominated by a magnificent pianoforte that gleamed in the lamplight. "Do you play?" Adrian asked. "Yes, though I have not had much opportunity lately. We sold our instrument 2 years ago. Would you play for me now?" Lydia moved to the pianoforte, running her fingers across the keys. She chose a piece by Mozart, melancholy and beautiful, and as she played, she became aware of Adrian standing nearby, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. When the final notes faded, silence hung between them. Then Adrian crossed the room with sudden purpose, stopping so close that Lydia could see the rapid pulse in his throat. "Lydia," he said, her name rough on his lips, "I find myself in an impossible situation. This arrangement we made, this business transaction, it was supposed to be simple, but nothing about you is simple. I do not understand," she whispered, though her heart raced with dangerous hope. "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words emerging as though wrenched from somewhere deep within. "I did not mean to. I thought my heart died with Caroline 8 years ago. But you, with your strength and your kindness, and your refusal to be broken by circumstances that would destroy others, you have awakened something in me I thought lost forever." Lydia stood frozen, torn between joy and fear. "Adrian, our arrangement. Damn the arrangement," he said fiercely, then caught himself. "Forgive me, but I cannot continue this charade, cannot pretend for society's benefit when what I feel is real. I know I have no right to ask, that you agreed only to a temporary betrothal, but I must know, is there any possibility you might feel the same?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the loneliness of his 8 years of isolation, all the vulnerability he was offering her. Lydia reached up, touching his face gently. "I do not know when it happened. Perhaps when you helped that boy in the street, or when you offered Thomas a second chance, or during that first waltz, when I realized the Duke of Ice was really a man with a heart that had simply been frozen by grief. But yes, Adrian, I feel it too." He closed his eyes as though her words were a benediction. When he opened them again, they blazed with emotion. "Then may I? Would you allow me?" "Yes," she breathed. Adrian lowered his head, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, questioning, then deepened as Lydia responded, her hands coming up to his shoulders. It was nothing like she had imagined a first kiss would be. It was better, filled with promise and possibility, and the sweet ache of longing finally acknowledged. When they finally drew apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, "not as part of an arrangement, not to satisfy society or pay a debt, but because I choose you, and I hope you might choose me." "I do," Lydia said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I choose you, Adrian. I choose this, whatever it may be." They stood together in the music room as the night deepened around them. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had discovered that love could bloom even in the coldest winter, that hearts could heal if given the chance. Tomorrow, Adrian would take her to the registry office and burn the contract that had brought them together. She slept at last with that certainty in her chest. Yet by morning, the certainty had soured. The plan to attend the registry died the instant Mr. Price crossed the threshold with Carstairs' new threat. Tomorrow, it seemed, had been stolen in the night. Tomorrow they would face society as a truly engaged couple. But tonight, they simply held each other, grateful for the unexpected gift of second chances. The morning light filtering through the curtains of Lydia's chamber found her staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, despite the late hour she and Adrian had finally parted. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, her heart racing with the memory of his declaration. Yet even as joy flooded through her, a seed of doubt had taken root during the sleepless hours before dawn. She loved him. Of that, she was certain. But their love had been born from a transaction, built on the foundation of a fraudulent contract and desperate circumstances. How could she be sure it was real and not simply gratitude dressed in finer clothes? A knock at her door announced Mrs. Hensworth with the morning tea tray. "His Grace requests your presence in his study when you are ready, miss. He says there is no urgency, but that he wishes to speak with you before attending to business." Lydia dressed with care, choosing a morning gown of soft grey that suddenly seemed too plain for a woman who had been proposed to the night before. She found Adrian pacing before the fireplace in his study, still in his shirt sleeves despite the hour, his dark hair dishevelled, as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly. "You did not sleep," she observed from the doorway. He turned, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen. No, I have been thinking about what I said last night, what I asked of you. Lydia, I do not wish you to feel obligated by my declaration. If you need time to consider, if you wish to maintain our original arrangement, do you regret it? She asked quietly. What you said? No, he replied fiercely, crossing the room to take her hands. I regret only that I might have overwhelmed you, might have placed you in an impossible position. You came to me seeking safety from one form of captivity. I would not trap you in another, even one gilded with affection. And if I told you I felt the same way last night because I was caught up in the moment, Lydia forced herself to ask. Because I was grateful for your protection and confused gratitude with something deeper. Adrian's face tightened with pain, but he did not release her hands. Then I would honor our original agreement. At the end of the 21 days, I would let you go, and I would never speak of this again. The honesty in his voice, the willingness to accept her rejection without argument, told Lydia more than any declaration could. This was not a man seeking to possess her, but one offering himself to be chosen. I am frightened, she admitted. Everything between us has happened so quickly, born from circumstances neither of us controlled. How can we trust what we feel? We cannot, Adrian said simply. Not entirely. Love, I think, always requires a leap of faith. He paused, seeming to gather courage. But perhaps we need not leap immediately. What if we extended our arrangement, not the contract, but our time together? You could remain here, we could court properly, and at the end of a month or two, or however long you need, you could decide if what you feel is real. Before Lydia could respond, Mr. Price burst into the study without announcement, his face pale with urgency. Your Grace, Miss Whitmore, I apologize for the intrusion, but there is a matter requiring immediate attention. What is it? Adrian demanded, instantly alert. Lord Carstairs has returned to London. He appeared at my office this morning with what he claims is the original registry document from Cheapside. He alleges that what you purchased from him was merely a personal copy and that the official registry still lists Miss Whitmore as collateral for Thomas Whitmore's debt. The room seemed to tilt beneath Lydia's feet. That is impossible. You paid him £20,000 for what he represented as the complete transaction, Price said grimly. But he now claims the registry clerk possesses the true original, recorded officially in the registry books. He is demanding £50,000 to surrender it, or he will expose the scandal publicly. Adrian's expression had turned to ice. The warmth of moments before vanished behind the mask of the Duke of Northmere. Where is he now? At the Clarendon Hotel. He says he will wait there until this evening for your response. If he receives no word by 8 o'clock, he will take his claims to the newspapers. After Price departed to make inquiries about the registry records, Adrian and Lydia stood in tense silence. He is lying, Lydia said finally. He must be. Perhaps, Adrian agreed. But the threat alone is enough to destroy your reputation. Even if we prove the document is a forgery, the scandal of its existence will spread through London within hours. Then there is nothing left to burn. Adrian said at last. Only ash where their lies pretended to be law. Lydia exhaled. The promise had been kept, only by a cleaner fire. Society does not wait for proof before passing judgment. Then pay him, Lydia said desperately. £50,000, £100,000, whatever he demands. No. Adrian's voice was hard. I will not reward extortion. Carstairs will bleed us dry, returning again and again with new demands. We must end this permanently. How? Lydia asked, fear making her voice sharp. He holds power over us as long as that document exists, real or forged. Adrian was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold with calculation. Then we ensure he no longer has power. We destroy him before he can destroy you. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of activity. Adrian summoned Thomas from Bloomsbury, and when her brother arrived, still in his work clothes from the shipyard, Lydia saw the change weeks of honest labour had wrought in him. He stood straighter, his eyes clearer, though guilt still shadowed his features when he looked at her. I heard Carstairs has returned, Thomas said without preamble. Mr. Crawford received word this morning. If there is anything I can do to help, anything at all, you need only ask. There is, Adrian replied. I need you to tell me everything you know about Carstairs' methods, every conversation you had with him, every threat he made, every other gentleman you saw in his company. Leave nothing out, no matter how trivial it seems. For 2 hours, Thomas recounted his dealings with Carstairs, and as he spoke, a pattern emerged. Carstairs had approached at least 6 other young men of good family but limited means, offering the same bargain: sign over something of value as collateral, receive extended credit, and pray you could win back your losses before the debt came due. There was a Lord Pembroke, Thomas said hesitantly, an older gentleman, perhaps 45. He died 2 years ago, supposedly from a riding accident. But the rumour among the gaming houses was that Carstairs had held his debts, and after Pembroke died, Carstairs somehow inherited a significant portion of his estate. Adrian and Price exchanged meaningful glances. That gives us leverage, Adrian said. But we need proof. Price, I want you to find every man Carstairs has cheated, every family he has ruined. Offer them protection in exchange for testimony. We will need them by tonight. Your Grace. Price hesitated. If we act tonight, there is no time to verify the registry document. We risk exposing ourselves without knowing if his threat is genuine. Then we make him believe we are capitulating, Adrian said. I will send word that I agree to his demands, that I will meet him at 8 o'clock to transfer the funds. But the meeting will not be private. We will ensure there are witnesses, men of power, who can hear what Carstairs has to say and judge the truth of it. By afternoon, Adrian had assembled an unlikely gathering in the drawing room of his Grosvenor Square residence. 3 magistrates, including Sir Robert Matheson, known for his incorruptibility, the Earl of Ashworth, Lady Margaret's cousin, and a man whose word carried weight in Parliament, and an elderly gentleman Lydia did not recognise until Adrian introduced him. This is Mr. Whitfield, Adrian said. He served as solicitor in Cheapside for 30 years before retiring. He has knowledge of Carstairs' dealings that will prove invaluable. Mr. Whitfield was perhaps 70, frail but sharp-eyed. Your Grace, he said, his voice thin but steady. I have waited years for someone with the power to stop Lord Carstairs. He has destroyed too many good families, ruined too many honest men. If my testimony can help end his schemes, I offer it gladly. What do you know of his methods? Sir Robert asked. Carstairs uses a corrupt clerk at the Cheapside registry, a man named Perkins, who falsifies documents for a fee. The registry books show entries that never truly existed, contracts that were never legally filed. But proving forgery requires examining the original ledgers, and Perkins keeps those hidden. Without access to them, Carstairs can claim any document is legitimate. Then we get access, Adrian said decisively. Sir Robert, can you obtain a warrant to search the registry? On what grounds? The magistrate asked. Suspicion alone is insufficient. On the grounds that Lord Carstairs is attempting to extort £50,000 from me using a document of questionable legality, Adrian replied. I will swear out a complaint this afternoon. The plan took shape rapidly. Adrian would meet Carstairs at the appointed hour, with the assembled witnesses concealed in an adjacent room. Mr. Price would present a banker's draft for £50,000. But before any exchange occurred, Sir Robert would enter with constables and a warrant to seize all documents in Carstairs' possession. Simultaneously, other constables would raid the Cheapside registry and secure the ledgers before Perkins could destroy evidence. As evening approached, Lydia found herself alone with Thomas in the library. Her brother stood at the window, watching the sun set over London's rooftops. I am sorry, he said quietly. Those words feel meaningless after everything, but I do not know what else to say. I brought this destruction upon you, and you have repaid my betrayal with forgiveness I do not deserve. You are my brother, Lydia replied, and despite everything, I love you. But Thomas, if you ever gamble again, if you ever place me or anyone else in such a position, I will not help you. This is your final chance to become the man our father hoped you would be. I know, Thomas said, turning to face her. These weeks at the shipyard, the honest work, the exhaustion at the end of each day, It has shown me what I threw away pursuing empty dreams at gaming tables. I do not expect you to trust me again quickly, but I swear to you, Lydia, I will spend the rest of my life earning back what I lost. At precisely 8 o'clock, Lord Carstairs arrived at the house in Grosvenor Square, his expression smug with anticipated victory. Adrian received him in the formal drawing room, Mr. Price at his side with a leather portfolio that presumably contained the promised funds. "Your Grace," Carstairs said, offering a mocking bow. "How wise of you to see reason. £50,000, and this unpleasantness can be forgotten." "Show me the document first," Adrian demanded. Carstairs withdrew a folded paper from his coat, holding it just out of reach. The original registry entry, signed by Thomas Whitmore and recorded officially. "You will note the clerk's seal and the date of filing. All quite legitimate." "Legitimate," a new voice said from the doorway, "is not the word I would use." Sir Robert Matheson entered, followed by 3 constables. Behind them came the Earl of Ashworth and the other magistrates, their presence transforming the private meeting into an official proceeding. Carstairs' face drained of colour. "What is this?" "This," Adrian said coldly, "is the end of your schemes, Carstairs. You are under arrest for attempted extortion, forgery, and fraud." What followed was chaos. Carstairs attempted to flee but was restrained by the constables. The document was seized and examined by the magistrates, who noted immediately the irregularities in the supposed clerk's seal. And then, word arrived from Cheapside that the registry office had been searched, the corrupt clerk, Perkins, arrested, and the ledgers secured. Mr. Whitfield examined the registry books with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading such records. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim with satisfaction. The entry Carstairs claims is registered does not exist in the official ledgers. The page where it should appear shows evidence of alteration, with a newer ink inconsistent with entries from 3 months past. This is a forgery, executed recently, likely within the past week. Wah! Carstairs slumped in the constable's grip, all his arrogance evaporated. "You have no idea what you have done, Northmere. There are others, powerful men who will not take kindly to your interference." "Then they can join you in facing the magistrate," Adrian replied. "I have compiled testimony from 8 families you have ruined, Lord Carstairs. Forgery, extortion, and evidence linking you to the suspicious death of Lord Pembroke. You will spend the next 20 years in prison if you are fortunate. If you are not, you will hang." As Carstairs was led away in irons, Lydia felt as though she could finally breathe. The nightmare that had begun with Thomas's confession was truly over. But even as relief washed through her, she saw Adrian's expression and recognized the cost of their victory. He had been forced to expose her family's shame publicly, to gather witnesses who would spread the story of Thomas's betrayal and her near ruin throughout London. They had won, but the price was her reputation, exactly as he had feared. The scandal broke across London society with the force of a summer storm. By morning, the newspapers carried detailed accounts of Lord Carstairs' arrest, the discovery of the fraudulent registry, and the testimony of families he had ruined. But they also carried something else. The full story of how Miss Lydia Whitmore had nearly been sold to pay her brother's gambling debts. Lydia learned of it when Lady Margaret arrived at the house in Grosvenor Square before breakfast, her face pale with distress, clutching several newspapers in her gloved hands. "My dear," Margaret said without preamble, "you must prepare yourself. The gossip sheets have printed everything." Lydia took one of the papers, her hands trembling as she read the headline. "Duke rescues Viscount's daughter from fraudulent contract. Miss W. nearly sold as property to settle gaming debts." The article spared no detail. Thomas's gambling, the illegal contract, even the original betrothal arrangement between Lydia and Adrian. What the writer could not verify, they speculated upon. And the speculation was far worse than the truth. "They are calling me a victim in public and a fortune hunter in private," Lydia said quietly, scanning the cruel assessments printed beneath veiled references to certain young ladies who use desperate circumstances to ensnare wealthy peers. Adrian entered the breakfast room, his expression thunderous. He took one look at the newspapers and his jaw tightened. "I will sue every publication that has printed falsehoods." "You cannot sue speculation," Lady Margaret said wearily, "and the truth alone is damaging enough. Lydia, you must leave London immediately. Return to Bath with me until this tempest passes." "No," Lydia said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I will not hide. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not behave as though I have." "Society does not care about innocence," Margaret countered. "They care only about scandal. If you remain here, you will be cut by every respectable house in Mayfair." As if to prove her point, a footman entered with a silver salver bearing several cards. "Begging your pardon, miss, but these were just delivered. The callers did not wait for a response." Lydia took the cards, recognizing the names of ladies who had been coolly polite at the Ashworth ball. Each bore the same terse message, variations of "regret that prior commitments prevent further acquaintance," or "must decline extending social courtesies at this time." "You see," Margaret said, "they are abandoning you already." But before Lydia could respond, Mrs. Hensworth appeared with another delivery, this one a sealed letter bearing the crest of Lady Ashworth. Lydia broke the seal with shaking fingers and read, "My dear Miss Whitmore, I have read the accounts in this morning's papers with great distress, not at your conduct, which has been nothing but dignified throughout this ordeal, but at the eagerness with which certain members of society rush to condemn a young woman who has been victimized by circumstances beyond her control. I write to assure you that my doors remain open to you, and that I consider it an honor to count you among my acquaintances. I am planning a small gathering 3 days hence, and I hope very much that you and the Duke will attend. Let them see that not all of London society has lost its capacity for compassion. Yours in friendship, Charlotte Ashworth." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Lady Ashworth has invited us to a gathering," she said, showing Adrian the letter. "Then we shall attend," he replied immediately. "We will not allow cowards and gossips to dictate how we live our lives." But the days that followed tested that resolve. Walking in Hyde Park with Lady Margaret, Lydia endured turned backs and whispered comments that were meant to be overheard. "There she is, the girl who was bought and sold. I heard the Duke paid £20,000 for her. Makes one wonder what he expects in return. Poor thing, she likely had no choice but to accept his charity. What else could she do?" The cruelty of that last comment stung most because it contained truth. She had been desperate, and Adrian had saved her. But what the gossips could not see, what they would never understand, was that what had begun as a transaction had transformed into something real, something precious. It was during an afternoon call to the lending library that Lydia encountered Lady Worthington, one of the most influential hostesses in Mayfair, and a woman known for her cutting wit and sharper judgments. Lydia was examining a volume of poetry when the lady's voice rang out across the reading room. "Miss Whitmore, how brave of you to show your face in public. Or should I say how bold? Tell me, is it true what they say about your arrangement with the Duke, that you were sold like common goods to settle debts?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Lydia, waiting to see how she would respond to such a direct attack. Lydia set down the book she had been holding and turned to face Lady Worthington with perfect composure. "It is true that my brother made grievous errors that placed our family in jeopardy. It is true that Lord Carstairs exploited those errors through illegal means. And it is true that the Duke of Northmere intervened to prevent a terrible injustice. But I was never sold, Lady Worthington. I was rescued. And if that makes me common goods in your estimation, then I am grateful to be so classified, for it means I need never aspire to the cruel sophistication you represent." She curtsied with impeccable correctness and departed the library, her head high, despite the trembling in her limbs. Only when she reached the street did she allow herself to lean against the building, drawing deep breaths. "That was magnificently done," came a familiar voice. Lady Margaret had witnessed the exchange from the doorway. "Your mother would have been proud." "I do not feel magnificent," Lydia admitted. "I feel exhausted. How long must I endure this, Aunt Margaret? How many times must I defend my honour against people who have already decided I have none?" "Until they find something more interesting to gossip about," Margaret said pragmatically. "Or until someone of greater influence than Lady Worthington demonstrates that you are to be accepted." That evening, as Lydia dressed for Lady Ashworth's gathering, she found herself questioning whether she had the strength to continue. The gown Mrs. Hensworth had selected was beautiful, pale rose silk that brought colour to her cheeks, but Lydia saw only a woman playing a part she no longer understood. "You look troubled," Adrian said from the doorway, then checked himself. "Forgive me. I should have knocked. It does not matter," Lydia replied wearily. "Nothing seems to matter anymore. Whatever we do, whatever we say, they have decided who and what I am." Adrian crossed the room to stand behind her, his hands settling gently on her shoulders as their eyes met in the mirror. "Then let them decide. You know the truth, Lydia. I know the truth. Is that not enough?" "I thought it would be," she admitted. "But facing their judgment day after day, hearing what they say about you, about us, I begin to wonder if we can survive this, if love is enough to withstand such constant assault." "Love," Adrian said quietly, "is not tested by easy days and pleasant company. It is tested by exactly this, by the world telling you that what you feel is false or shameful or impossible. And every time you choose to believe in it anyway, you make it stronger." He turned her gently to face him. "I told you that I fell in love with you, and I meant it. But Lydia, if the cost of that love is too high, if society's cruelty is more than you can bear, then I will let you go. I will give you the settlement I promised, see you established safely away from London, and I will tell anyone who asks that the decision was mine. Your reputation will recover in time." "You would do that?" Lydia asked, searching his face. "After everything?" "I would do anything," Adrian replied simply, "to see you happy, even if that happiness does not include me." The selflessness of the offer, the willingness to sacrifice his own desires for her peace, undid something in Lydia. She had been so focused on surviving society's judgment that she had forgotten the most important truth. The man standing before her loved her not because of circumstances or contracts, but because he chose to, freely and completely. "I do not want to leave," she said, her voice breaking. "I want to face them together. I want to attend Lady Ashworth's gathering and every other cursed social event in London. And I want them to see that they cannot break us." Adrian's expression transformed, hope and relief mingling with something fiercer. "Then we shall show them exactly that." Lady Ashworth's gathering proved to be more populated than Lydia had anticipated. The drawing room was filled with perhaps 40 guests, and their reaction when the Duke of Northmere and Miss Whitmore were announced was mixed. Some faces showed disapproval, others curiosity, but a significant number, particularly among the older ladies, displayed something that looked remarkably like approval. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore," Lady Ashworth greeted them warmly. "How delighted I am that you could attend. Come, there are several people most anxious to make your acquaintance." What followed was perhaps the strangest evening of Lydia's life. Lady Ashworth, it transpired, had gathered a coalition of society's more progressive members, ladies and gentlemen who had read the accounts of Carstairs' schemes with outrage rather than scandal-hungry glee. "My dear Miss Whitmore," said the Countess of Devonshire, a formidable woman of perhaps 60, "I have 4 sons, and I live in terror that they will fall prey to men like Carstairs. What you and your family endured was an injustice, not a scandal. Anyone who cannot see that distinction is a fool." Similar sentiments were echoed throughout the evening. The Earl of Merrick, whose nephew had apparently been victimised by Carstairs years earlier, praised Adrian for his courage in exposing the scheme. Lady Pemberton, whose husband had hosted that first uncomfortable dinner, apologised for the coldness of some guests. "I confess," she said frankly, "that I did not understand the full circumstances at the time. I saw only that a Duke of Northmere's standing was courting the daughter of a near-bankrupt Viscount, and I made assumptions. I was wrong, and I am sorry." As the evening progressed, Lydia began to feel something she had not experienced since the scandal broke: hope. These people, influential and respected, were choosing to support them publicly. Their approval would not silence all criticism, but it would provide a counterweight to the judgment of ladies like Worthington. On the carriage ride home, Lydia sat close to Adrian, her hand clasped in his. "I did not expect that," she admitted. "I thought we would face only condemnation." "Neither did I," Adrian replied. "But perhaps we underestimated the capacity of decent people to recognize indecent behavior when they see it. Carstairs was the villain in this tale, not you. And yet," Lydia said quietly, "there are still many who see only that I lived in your house as your betrothed before any wedding occurred. That stain will not wash away easily." Adrian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that made her heart race. "Then perhaps we should give them a wedding to talk about instead." Adrian's proposal, spoken in the quiet intimacy of the carriage, hung between them like a promise and a question. But in the days that followed, Lydia found herself pulling away rather than moving closer. Not because she doubted her feelings, but because she could not silence the voice in her mind, asking whether those feelings were real or merely a response to circumstance. A week after Lady Ashworth's gathering, Lydia stood in Adrian's study, having requested a private conversation. He looked up from his correspondence, his expression immediately concerned. "You look troubled," he observed, setting down his pen. "Has something happened?" "Adrian," she began, then faltered. The words she needed to say felt impossible, like trying to tear down something beautiful, simply because she feared its foundation was unsound. "I have been thinking about your proposal. About us." He stood, moving around the desk, but keeping a respectful distance. And I am not certain we can trust what we feel," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Our entire relationship was born from desperation and transactions. I came to you because I had no choice. You helped me to repay a debt and escape your isolation. How can we know that what we call love is not simply gratitude dressed up in finer clothing?" Adrian was silent for a long moment, his face carefully neutral, but she saw the flash of pain in his blue eyes before he mastered it. "What would you have us do?" "I need time," Lydia said, the words tearing at her even as she spoke them. "Time away from London, from you, to understand my own heart, without the pressure of society's judgment or the comfort of your protection. I need to know if I would choose you without all the circumstances that bound us together." "You wish to leave," Adrian said quietly. It was not a question. "Lady Margaret has offered me her home in Bath. I would stay there for a time, perhaps several months. I would write to you, and you to me if you wished. And at the end of that time, I would know if what I feel is real." Adrian moved to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained but steady. "I will not keep you here against your will, Lydia. If you need this separation to find clarity, then I will grant it. But know that my feelings will not change in your absence. What I feel for you is not circumstantial." "How can you be certain?" Lydia asked desperately. "How can either of us be certain when everything between us has been so complicated from the beginning?" He turned then, and the raw emotion in his face nearly broke her resolve. "Because I have lived without love for 8 years, Lydia. I know what emptiness feels like, what isolation tastes like, and I know that what I feel when you are in the room, when you laugh at something I say, when you defend yourself with such courage against those who would diminish you, that is not emptiness. That is not isolation. That is being alive again." Lydia felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "And what if in 6 months I decide that what I felt was not love? What if distance reveals that we were both clinging to each other because we were both so desperately lonely? Then," Adrian said softly, crossing to her and gently wiping the tears from her face, "I will let you go. I will keep my promise of the settlement, and I will never speak of this again. Your happiness matters more to me than my own desires, Lydia. If you need proof of my love, let that be it." The arrangements were made within 3 days. Lady Margaret, though initially reluctant, agreed that perhaps distance would provide clarity. Thomas, now settled into his work at the shipyard and living respectably in the house in Bloomsbury, came to say farewell to his sister with sadness but understanding. "You have given me so much, Lydia," he said as they stood in the entrance hall of the Grosvenor Square house. "You sacrificed everything for my mistakes, and now you are sacrificing your own happiness to be certain it is real. I hope you find what you are seeking." And I hope, he glanced at Adrian, who stood apart, allowing them privacy, that you realize what you already have. The morning Lydia departed for Bath, Adrian insisted on accompanying her and Lady Margaret to the coaching inn. The journey would take the better part of a day, and Lydia had packed only what she needed, leaving most of the beautiful gowns and possessions Adrian had provided behind. At the inn, as the coach was being prepared, Adrian drew Lydia aside for a private farewell. "I have something for you," he said, pressing a small leather journal into her hands. "I thought you might wish to record your thoughts during this time." "And he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wrote something on the first page. A reminder, perhaps, of what you are trying to decide." Lydia clutched the journal to her chest. "Adrian, Do not say anything now," he interrupted gently. "Take your time, Lydia. Discover who you are without the weight of scandal and society's judgment. And if, at the end of it all, you decide you wish to return, I will be waiting." He kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender and restrained that it made Lydia's heart ache. Then he helped her into the coach, bowed to Lady Margaret, and stepped back as the driver urged the horses forward. Lydia watched through the window as Adrian's figure grew smaller, standing alone on the street, his hand raised in farewell. Only when they had turned the corner and he was out of sight did she allow herself to open the journal. On the first page, in Adrian's precise handwriting, were 3 lines. "Love is not possession. It is liberation. Choose yourself first, Lydia. If that choice leads you back to me, I will know it is real." The weeks in Bath passed with surprising swiftness. Lady Margaret's home was modest but comfortable, a townhouse in the newer part of the city with views of the surrounding hills. Lydia fell into a routine. She walked daily through the parks and along the Crescent, visited the lending library, and began to paint with watercolours, a hobby she had abandoned years ago when her family's circumstances had required selling her supplies. She wrote in the journal Adrian had given her, recording her thoughts and observations, her fears and hopes. And every week, a letter arrived from London in Adrian's handwriting, never demanding, never pleading, simply sharing details of his life and asking about hers. He wrote of Thomas's progress at the shipyard, how her brother had been promoted to a supervisory role and was proving himself reliable and sober. He wrote of changes to Northmere Hall, renovations he was planning that would make the house lighter and more welcoming. He wrote of political matters in Parliament and new investments in shipping ventures. What he did not write was anything that might pressure her to return. He never asked when she would come back, never spoke of missing her, though Lydia could read between the carefully neutral lines and sense the loneliness he would not admit. She replied in kind, telling him of her days, of the friends she was making among Bath's quieter society, of the watercolour paintings she was creating. She asked his opinion on books she was reading and political questions she did not fully understand. Their letters became a conversation, intimate and honest in a way their face-to-face interactions in London had never quite achieved. It was during the 3rd month of her stay, on a particularly beautiful autumn afternoon, as Lydia sat painting in Lady Margaret's garden, that the realization struck her with startling clarity. She missed him. Not the protection he had offered, not the escape from scandal, not even the grand house or the security of his name. She missed Adrian himself, the dry humour that emerged when he was relaxed, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the quiet strength that asked for nothing but offered everything. "You have decided," Lady Margaret observed, looking up from her embroidery. "I have," Lydia admitted, setting down her paintbrush. "I was so afraid that what I felt was gratitude or circumstance, but Aunt Margaret, I miss him. Not because I need him, but because I want him, because life is fuller when he is in it." "Then why are you still here?" Margaret asked with a small smile. "Because," Lydia said slowly, "I wanted to be sure, and now I am." The letter she wrote that evening was different from all the others. "Adrian, I have spent these months trying to separate gratitude from love, circumstance from choice. I have lived without your protection, without your presence, without anything binding me to you. And I have discovered something important. I do not want to live without you, not because I need your help or your name or your resources, but because you make me better. You make me braver. You make me want to be the woman I see reflected in your eyes. If your offer still stands, if you still wish to marry me, then my answer is yes. Not out of obligation or gratitude, but out of choice. I choose you, Adrian. I choose us. Yours, Lydia. She sealed the letter and sent it by express post that very evening, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The reply could take days to arrive, depending on when Adrian received her letter and how quickly he could respond. But the next morning, barely past dawn, a commotion in the street below woke her. Lydia rushed to the window and saw a familiar figure descending from a travel-worn carriage, his dark hair dishevelled, his evening clothes suggesting he had ridden through the night. Adrian. She threw a dressing gown over her nightdress and raced downstairs, not caring about propriety, not caring about anything except reaching him. She flung open the front door just as he was about to knock. They stared at each other for a breathless moment. Then Adrian pulled her letter from his coat pocket, the paper crumpled from being held too tightly. "I received this last night," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "I left London within the hour. I could not wait, could not send a letter when I needed to say this in person. Lydia, these 3 months have been the longest of my life. Every day without you was a reminder of what I stand to lose, but I would have waited forever if that was what you needed. The fact that you chose to return, that you chose me, it means everything. I love you," Lydia said simply, "not because you saved me, but because of who you are, because you let me go so I could choose to come back." Adrian closed the distance between them, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her with a passion that left no doubt about the reality of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he cupped her face in his hands. "Marry me," he said. "Not in 6 months, not after society forgets our scandal, but now, as soon as we can arrange it. I have spent 8 years living half a life, and I will not waste another moment." "Yes," Lydia breathed. "Yes, yes, yes." Behind them, Lady Margaret cleared her throat from the doorway, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "Perhaps we might discuss wedding arrangements after His Grace has had some rest. He looks ready to collapse." But Adrian was smiling, truly smiling, in a way Lydia had never seen, and she knew that this, finally, was real. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the chapel at Northmere Hall, the estate in Yorkshire that had been the Valancourt family seat for generations. Lydia had never seen the property before, having spent all her time with Adrian in his London residence, and when their carriage crested the final hill and the house came into view, she caught her breath. Northmere Hall was not the dark, imposing fortress she had half expected. Instead, it sprawled across the landscape in warm golden stone, its windows catching the autumn sunlight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. The grounds surrounding it had been transformed since Adrian's return from Bath, the neglected gardens now blooming with late-season roses, the lawns manicured, the lake that gave the estate its name shimmering silver in the distance. "You have changed it," Lydia said, turning to Adrian beside her in the carriage. "I wanted it to be worthy of you," he replied simply. "The house had been a mausoleum for 8 years, filled with ghosts and regrets. It needed life again. We needed life again." Mrs. Hensworth greeted them at the entrance, her usual stern expression softening into something approaching a smile. "Welcome home, Miss Whitmore. Or I should say, welcome to your future home, as you will be mistress here after the wedding." The guest list for the ceremony was deliberately small. Thomas arrived the day before, nervous but sober, his hands calloused from honest work and his eyes clear. He embraced Lydia fiercely when he saw her. "You look happy," he said. "Truly happy. I cannot remember the last time I saw you smile that way." "I am happy," Lydia confirmed. "And Thomas, I am proud of you. Mr. Crawford's reports have been excellent. You have become the man Father always hoped you would be." Thomas's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "I will not disappoint you again, Lydia. Or him. I swear it." Lady Margaret arrived with the Countess of Ashworth, who had insisted on attending despite the journey from London. Mr. Price came as witness, along with Mr. Whitfield, the elderly solicitor whose testimony had been crucial in destroying Carstairs. Even Mr. Crawford, Thomas's supervisor, attended, bringing word that Thomas had been offered a permanent position managing one of Adrian's smaller warehouses. The evening before the wedding, as the sun set over the Yorkshire hills, Adrian found Lydia in the music room, the same pianoforte from the London house having been transported to Northmere at his request. "I wanted you to have it here," he explained. "This is where we discovered we could be honest with each other, where I first allowed myself to hope you might return my feelings." Lydia rose from the bench and crossed to him. "Adrian, there is something I need to tell you. About Caroline." His expression shuttered slightly. "You need not speak of her." "But I must," Lydia insisted, "because I have been thinking about what you said, about how you felt guilty for being relieved when she died. Adrian, I do not think that makes you heartless. I think it makes you human. You were trapped in an arrangement you did not choose, bound to a woman you could not love. Her death was a tragedy, but your relief at being freed from that obligation was natural." Adrian was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes fixed on some distant point. "I have carried that guilt for 8 years, he said finally. "The belief that I was somehow responsible, that my lack of love killed her as surely as the fever did." "Love does not work that way," Lydia said gently. "Caroline died because illness is cruel and random, not because you could not give her what she deserved. But Adrian, I want you to know that I do not resent her memory. The portrait you have kept of her, the one Mrs. Hensworth mentioned from your London house, I want you to display it here if you wish. She was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. I will not ask you to erase that." "I had it moved to the gallery," Adrian admitted, "along with the portraits of my parents and grandparents. She deserves to be remembered with dignity, but not to haunt our future." He took Lydia's hands in his. "You have given me so many gifts, Lydia. Freedom to feel again, permission to be imperfect, hope that love could be real rather than obligatory. I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve them. You already do," she whispered. The wedding ceremony the next morning was simple but profound. Lydia wore a gown of ivory silk, elegant rather than elaborate, with her mother's pearls at her throat, the only jewels that had not been sold to pay Thomas's debts, which Adrian had somehow located and purchased back for her. Thomas walked her down the chapel aisle, his arm steady, his pride in her evident. Adrian stood at the altar looking impossibly handsome in formal dress, but it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made Lydia's heart swell. Not the cool, controlled Duke of Ice that London society knew, but the man beneath, vulnerable and open and utterly devoted. The vows were traditional, but when Adrian spoke the words, "With my body I thee worship," his voice broke with emotion. And when Lydia promised to love and honour him, she met his eyes and added softly, "I choose you, Adrian, today and every day." The small gathering erupted in applause as they were pronounced husband and wife. Thomas cheered loudest of all, his joy for his sister overcoming his usual reserve. The wedding breakfast was a cheerful affair held in Northmere's dining room, which had been decorated with flowers from the newly restored gardens. Lady Margaret gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure, speaking of love that came when least expected and proved itself through trial. "My niece," she concluded, raising her glass, "has shown more courage in the past year than most people display in a lifetime. And the Duke has proven that even the coldest winter can give way to spring. To the bride and groom, may your love continue to bloom like Northmere's gardens." As evening approached, the guests began to depart, each offering congratulations and best wishes. Thomas was the last to leave, returning to London and his new position with a promise to write weekly and visit at Christmas. "Thank you," he said to Adrian as they shook hands, "for giving me a chance when I deserved none, for saving my sister when I had endangered her. I will work every day to earn the faith you have shown in me." "See that you do," Adrian replied, but his tone was kind. "And Thomas, remember that redemption is not a single grand gesture, but a series of small choices made consistently over time. Make the right choices." After the house had emptied and the servants had retired for the night, Adrian led Lydia up the grand staircase to the ducal chambers. rooms that had been closed since his parents' deaths decades ago. He had had them completely refurbished, clearing away the heavy furnishings and dark draperies, replacing them with lighter fabrics and warmer colours. I wanted everything to be new for us, he explained. No ghosts, no memories of anyone else, just our beginning. Lydia moved through the rooms, touching the silk coverlets, admiring the view from the windows that overlooked the lake. In the sitting room adjoining the bedchamber, she found something that made her stop in wonder. Her watercolours from Bath, carefully framed and hung in a place of honour. "How did you?" she began. "Lady Margaret sent them," Adrian admitted. "She thought you might like to have them here, to remember that you chose this freely, that you came to me not from desperation, but from love." Lydia turned to him, tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I did choose this. I choose you, Adrian. Every moment, every day, for the rest of our lives." He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her with a passion that promised everything and more. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "I was dead before I met you," he whispered. "I was walking through life but not living it, trapped in grief and isolation of my own making. You brought me back to life, Lydia. You gave me hope again. We saved each other," Lydia replied. "You gave me safety when I had none. I gave you a reason to open your heart again. We built something real from ashes and desperation, and that makes it stronger than anything created from ease." 3 years later, Northmere Hall had transformed into something neither Lydia nor Adrian could have imagined during those desperate days in London. The house rang with laughter and life, no longer a cold monument to past sorrows, but a home filled with warmth and promise. Lydia stood in the newly planted rose garden, her 2-year-old daughter Caroline Margaret toddling beside her, trying to catch butterflies that danced among the blooms. The child had been named for both Adrian's lost love and Lydia's beloved aunt, a bridge between past and future that honoured what had been while embracing what was. Adrian emerged from the house, carrying the latest correspondence from London. "Thomas writes that he has been elected to a position on the Merchants' Council," he said, pride evident in his voice. 5 years sober, respected in his community, and engaged to marry the daughter of his former supervisor. "I believe your brother has finally found his way." "Thanks to you," Lydia replied, watching as Adrian swept their daughter into his arms, making her giggle with delight. "Thanks to all of us," Adrian corrected. "Thomas chose to change. You chose to forgive. I chose to offer opportunity rather than judgment. We all made choices, Lydia. That is what saved us." Lady Margaret had taken up permanent residence in a cottage on the estate grounds, dividing her time between Bath and Yorkshire, delighting in her great niece and the peaceful life she had never expected to find. From London, reports arrived that Lord Carstairs had begun serving his 20-year sentence, his schemes fully exposed and his reputation destroyed. Mr. Whitfield had passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months after the trial, content that he had finally seen justice done. As sunset painted the Yorkshire sky in shades of gold and rose, Lydia and Adrian sat on the terrace overlooking the lake, Caroline asleep in Adrian's lap, a second child growing beneath Lydia's heart. "Do you ever regret it?" Adrian asked quietly. "The scandal, the judgment, all that you endured." Lydia thought of that desperate day when she had stood in her father's drawing room, facing Carstairs, and believing her life was over. She thought of the fear and uncertainty, the public humiliation, the painful separation when she had fled to Bath. She thought of all the hard moments that had brought her here. "No," she said finally, taking Adrian's hand, "because all of it, every painful moment, brought me to this, to you, to our children, to this life we have built together. I would endure it all again without hesitation." Adrian raised her hand to his lips. "As would I. Every cold, lonely year before you was worth it to arrive at this moment." As darkness fell over Northmere Hall, the windows glowed warm with lamplight, a beacon of home and hope. Inside, the rooms that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with love and laughter. The Duke, who had been frozen by grief, had learned to live again. The woman who had been sold as property had discovered her own worth, and together they had proven that even the darkest circumstances could give birth to the brightest joy. This, Lydia thought, as she rested her head on Adrian's shoulder, was what freedom truly meant. Not the absence of obligation or the escape from difficulty, but the choice to love despite all obstacles, to build a future from broken pieces, and to believe that second chances were not just possible, but precious beyond measure. The contract that had brought them together had burned to ashes years ago, but the choice they made each day to choose each other, that was a bond that would never break. The end.